The most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't being said. Peter Drucker. Listening, the Achilles heel of failure to communicate. Today I offer my thoughts on why the relentless compulsive need and pressure to vocalize, to repeat, and to reinforce one's own thoughts and perspective without taking the necessary time to listen to opposing viewpoints has taken us to a new, dangerous place. Two specific groups are the worst offenders and abusers of the vital need to communicate effectively through the process of listening. The first group is politicians. Even though all democratically elected politicians inevitably promise to listen to their constituents, once elected, almost all politicians choose instead to listen only to their own advisors, their own caucus, their own party whips. These politicians create an echo chamber, reinforcing their own thoughts and beliefs, abrogating their sworn duty to represent the very people who elected them. Some argue that these politicians were elected because of their stated beliefs, as represented by the platform and promises made before and during an election campaign. That is fundamentally true, but what happens to those promises after an election? If promises were exaggerated and ultimately not kept, who suffers? Not the politician, at least not until forced to face the music at the time of the next election. No, who suffers instead is the voter, whose voice is no longer heard. The voter whose voice is not welcomed until the next election because it is not needed. Those voices may not even be appreciated by some politicians, as they are an inconvenient reminder that there is accountability. The lack of accountability, the choice to not listen to constituents between elections, is what creates authoritarians, what creates despots. We have perfect examples at the moment. The most divisive, inflammatory excuse for a prime minister in Canadian history refuses to listen to an ever-growing, once silent majority. Instead, he chooses to listen to his globalist funders and his international strategists from World Economic Forum pushing a great reset, a new normal. Like the worst, most despicable despots in history, Trudeau is not only not listening to Canadians, but instead is actually trying to remove freedom of expression and freedom of thought through draconian legislation just announced last week once again. In the process, Trudeau's Liberals are suppressing the ability of Canadians to have an opinion contrary to the government and restricting our fundamental right to share that opinion. In short, Trudeau is at the moment a vanguard of politicians who have chosen to selectively listen. Politicians who refuse to listen to ideas and policies contrary to their own. What's the consequence in the real world? The Edelman Trust Barometer places politicians near the top of the least trusted occupations and members of society. 48% of respondents view governments and media as divisive forces in society. To quote, "Vicious cycle of distrust fueled by government and media." We find a world ensnared in a vicious cycle of distrust fueled by a growing lack of faith in governments and media. Through disinformation and division, these two institutions are feeding the cycle and exploiting it for commercial and political gain. These are quotes from Edelman.com, a privately held independent communications consulting firm with offices and resources deployed in many jurisdictions. Mainstream media is also a complicit agent and actor in this deconstruction of freedom of expression and freedom of speech. I could rail for hours against the corruption of the media industry. MSM is now a complicit, corrupt sycophant to governments and those in power. Plain and simple, mainstream media has been bought off and are almost as corrupt as any government. 46% do not trust mainstream media, and that number is growing. Like politicians, mainstream media has become a selective listener. MSM only wants to listen to, quote, and repeat those who support their prearranged narratives. Like politicians, Mainstream media has quit listening to voices they choose not to hear. Like Edelman suggests, a vicious circle of disinformation and division has been created, and all we value, freedom, civil liberties, and a healthy, balanced society, are suffering. Grievously suffering, silently suffering for far too long. We cannot remain silenced. We cannot remain marginalized. We must force those who would not listen to listen. How do we do that? By making them irrelevant, by exposing their transgressions publicly, by laying bare their agenda, by affirming your freedom and your rights. It is often repeated that journalism is dead. I've said it myself with a subtle nuance. Journalism in mainstream media is dead. Corporate interests now align with government interests to control the narrative. Thus, MSM is now euphemistically called narrative journalism. Not long ago, it would have been labeled propaganda, and you know what? It still is. Journalism with integrity does still exist, but it has now moved into the realm of independent media and citizen journalism. Options now exist for those who demand fair, unbiased, and timely reporting. As the trust in politicians and mainstream media erodes because of their own corruption and self-serving interests, trust in independent media and citizen journalism is growing. A cautionary note: to gain and maintain the public trust, independent media and citizen journalists must adhere to the highest journalistic standards now abandoned by mainstream media. Who, what, when, where, why? That was the first lesson for aspiring journalists and my first lesson as I forayed into journalism. Tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Another useful reminder: if you are going to speculate, make sure you say so. Do not report hearsay. Verify your facts before asserting them as true. Do the job that mainstream corporate media has abandoned, and we, the independent media and citizen journalists, can and will succeed for the benefit of all. A final word of advice: listen and observe. Document whoever and wherever possible. To expand on Peter Drucker, the most important thing in communication is hearing what isn't said, but additionally accurately reporting what is being said. Today, February 3rd, 2022, Glenn Waleska, your moderator and host, Voice of the West and Independent Media Canada. And again, please support independent media, and please support those voices that are trying to bring journalistic integrity back into the conversation here in Canada and elsewhere.